Look at any royal portrait, and you see power, wealth, and a bloodline said to be pure. But with the Habsburg dynasty, purity became a horrifying genetic tragedy. On November 6, 1661, in a dimly lit chamber of the royal palace in Madrid, the infante Charles II, full name Carlos II de España, entered the world with a body already devastated from the womb. His father was King Philip IV, the fourth monarch of Habsburg Spain, and his mother was Queen Mariana of Austria, both the granddaughter and the first cousin of her husband. They had wed in 1637 to consolidate dynastic power, but in doing so, they triggered a chain of incestuous marriages that would doom their son. At birth, Charles displayed every defect: an abnormally large head with unfused skull plates, an excessively protruding lower jaw, what would become known as the Habsburg jaw, and a tongue so oversized that his mouth could not close, causing him to drool constantly. Experienced royal midwives and court physicians recoiled in horror. Having never before encountered such a malformed newborn, even Queen Mariana herself could not suppress her shock. Retreating behind a velvet curtain and refusing to hold or nurse her child. This horror did not stem solely from his physical form, but from his lineage. King Philip IV, already twice married within the Spanish Habsburgs, had fathered several children who mostly died in infancy. By marrying Mariana of Austria herself, the granddaughter of Emperor Ferdinand II and daughter of the Archduke of Austria, Philip perpetuated a nightmarish inbreeding strategy. Mariana was simultaneously his wife and his cousin, creating a tangled web of relations. Charles's half-sisters, Infanta Maria Teresa and Infanta Margarita Teresa, likewise bore the heavy burden of an almost unvarying gene pool. Statistics show that over 80% of marriages in the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs were between close relatives, uncles, and nieces, first cousins, and even double cousins. As a result, when Charles II was born, all 8 of his direct great-grandparents descended from a single couple, Philip I and Joanna of Castile. His inbreeding coefficient was calculated at 0.254, higher than that of siblings, meaning more than 25% of his genes were identical copies, carrying countless dangerous mutations. The genetic consequences were far more than abstract numbers. They inflicted profound physical and mental suffering. From his first moments, Charles endured a catastrophically flawed body, a swollen skull, protruding jaw, and oversized tongue that prevented him from closing his mouth. He could not nurse normally and required feeding tubes. Even breathing and swallowing were constant struggles. Zeitzuras, labored breathing, and a sallow, ghastly complexion haunted the palace, alarming even the most seasoned royal physicians. Our story does not begin in glory, but in stark tragedy. Blood once deemed sacred became a scythe that destroyed the human body at birth. To understand how Charles journeyed from heir to Europe's mightiest empire, to victim of his own lineage, we must delve into the brutal history of inbreeding within the Habsburgs, a dynasty that held power through the closest of blood ties, yet sowed an inescapable tragedy. From the very moment of infancy, Charles had to contend with grave medical challenges. A typical baby would cry, nurse eagerly, and learn to crawl. But Charles was different. His mouth was misshapen, making nursing a struggle, and his skull was swollen, the bony sutures unjoined, giving his head a broad, distorted appearance. The wet nurses reported that he seldom cried not from contentment, but from sheer exhaustion of spirit. He would lie motionless, breathing in short, raspy gasps, his skin pale as parchment, his lower jaw twitching and drool pooling beneath his chin. In the 17th century, with no formula or modern medicine, a newborn unable to nurse was almost certainly doomed. Yet by some miracle, Charles survived, thanks to the devotion of wet nurses and the arcane remedies of the age mixtures of pearl powder, herbal concoctions, cattle blood, and countless superstitious treatments. They believed that by supplementing his body with pure substances from nature or animal sacrifice, his constitution might strengthen. Of course, none of these potions could counteract the deep-seated genetic damage coursing through his veins. As he grew, Charles's life remained more a struggle for survival than a childhood. By the age of 4, he could not walk. His legs were as thin as twigs. Bowed by rickets and too weak to bear his weight, the court had no choice but to commission a custom carriage, in which he was transported everywhere, like a perpetual infant. Speech, too, eluded him. His protruding jaw and oversized tongue prevented his mouth from closing, reducing his words to muffled syllables. Court scribes noted that one had to interpret his utterances as if translating a foreign tongue. Feeding was a daily ordeal. His teeth never met properly, so he could not chew. Instead, he swallowed food whole. Roast meats were cut into the smallest possible morsels. Vegetables were pureed, and breads were soaked in wine until they dissolved. Every meal left stains of drool and crumbs on his clothing, and silk napkins were kept at the ready by his side. These physical deformities came hand in hand with relentless illness. Measles, smallpox, chickenpox, and mumps swept through the palace like storms, each epidemic battering his already fragile frame. But the cruelest blow was hydrocephalus, an accumulation of fluid within his skull that caused his head to swell further, gave him splitting headaches, and triggered violent seizures that could confine him to bed for weeks. The finest Spanish physicians were at a loss, unable to understand the root cause or propose effective treatment. In such condition, Charles's childhood held no laughter or typical games. The grand banquets and glittering halls of the palace served only as an ominous backdrop to a prince locked in an ongoing battle between life and death. He grew up in pain and isolation. His every breath, a labor. His every step, a trial. Yet, despite the horror of his daily existence, Charles's plight was far from unnoticed. Courtiers whispered of the tragedy unfolding behind the palace gates, their voices hushed out of fear and pity. The crown's portraits attempted to soften his features. Yet even the most flattering painters could not entirely conceal the deformities that marked him as Habsburg-born. To the world outside, he remained a symbol of dynastic continuity. To those inside, he was a living testament to the perils of incestuous unions. Each night, as torches flickered along the marble corridors, Charles lay in his chamber caged by silk curtains. The echo of distant bells, a lullaby for a soul weighed down by suffering. His wet nurses would tend to him adjusting the carriage cushions, wiping away drool, and offering tepid broths while outside. The court hoped desperately for a miracle that never came. Thus, the story of Prince Charles II's infancy stands as a tragic monument to the consequences of incestuous marriage and unchecked ambition. In the end, he was not merely a sickly heir. He became the embodiment of a noble house's fatal flaw. Those who chronicled his life would speak of him in reverent tones. But history remembers Charles not for conquest or glory, but for his unending struggle against a genetic legacy too burdened to bear. When Charles turned 4 years old, the cruel legacy of his genetic inheritance became ever more apparent in both his movements and his speech. By that age, most children of his station would be scampering about the palace corridors, chattering cheerfully as they explored sunlit gardens. Yet Charles remained unable to stand on his own 2 feet. His legs were as spindly as bird bones, bowed from rickets and utterly lacking in strength. The royal carpenters had crafted a custom-wheeled chaise for him, a miniature carriage padded with velvet and gilded trim, yet even in that, he rode as helplessly as a newborn. His speech, too, proved a formidable challenge. The infamous Habsburg jaw caused his lower mandible to jut uncomfortably. While his oversized tongue prevented his lips from sealing, his words emerged in soft, muffled clicks and throaty murmurs, often indistinguishable from babble. Foreign ambassadors meeting the young prince for the first time forced polite smiles. But their private dispatches brimmed with shock, some likening his visage to two faces, stacked one before the other. Royal aides had to serve as interpreters, painstakingly parsing each slurred syllable and endlessly mopping away the drool that formed rivulets down his chin and soaked his silk garments. Feeding time became a spectacle both sorrowful and grotesque. With his upper and lower teeth unable to meet, Charles could not chew. Instead, he swallowed large pieces of food, whole. At state banquet, palace chefs were ordered to puree meats into a paste, so smooth it slid between his lips without resistance. Vegetables were simmered until they dissolved at the gentlest touch, and breads were soaked in fine wines to encourage disintegration. One English envoy recorded in his journal, "The prince devours whole lumps of roast lamb without chewing, swallowing them in silent succession, as though no mastication were needed. He might consume an entire lamb between two sittings." Servants hovered with crystal carafes of water and silver goblets of broth, ready to wash away the remnants of each brutal repast. Yet Charles's frailty extended far beyond his inability to walk or eat. His immune system, compromised by generations of inbreeding, offered little defense against the infectious scourges of the age. Throughout his childhood, he endured wave upon wave of epidemic illness. Measles left him fevered and feverish, his cheeks blotched with painful lesions. Smallpox raked his body with pustules that, once healed, left a map of indelible scars. Mumps and chickenpox ravaged his already weakened constitution, and at times he teetered on the brink of mortality. One particularly dreadful autumn, a virulent strain of influenza swept through the court. While other children shrieked in play, Charles lay shivering beneath layer upon layer of silk blankets, his tiny frame ravaged by violent chills. Physicians applied poultices of vinegar and oil to his limbs, yet his muscles trembled in relentless spasms, fearing contagion. Courtiers donned masks and withdrew to distant apartments, leaving the young prince confined to a chamber scented with lavender and camphor, meant to purify the air, though of little comfort against his ravages. In addition to the epidemic diseases, Charles suffered from chronic sores and abscesses on his skin, remnants of his battle with smallpox, and a testament to his body's inability to heal effectively. These festering wounds required daily attention. Royal surgeons would lance and dress the lesions with honey and linen strips, praying for a measure of relief. Yet healing remained elusive. The abscesses reopened as soon as they were superficially closed, turning his arms and legs into a landscape of fresh wounds and congealing pus. Against such relentless adversity, the young heir lived a life of endless palliative measures. The palace apothecaries brewed decoctions of willow bark for his fevers, administered swallows of brandy to warm his blood, and placed warm flannel compresses on his aching head. He was wrapped in layers of cloth, soaked in medicinal oils, and laid upon beds of feather-stuffed maroon cushions. Yet the pain lingered in every breath. Throughout these hardships, Charles's spirit remained gentle and subdued. He rarely expressed anger or frustration, though his large, dark eyes betrayed a sorrow beyond his years. The palace staff, having tended to him since infancy, spoke of soft interludes, when he would gaze at the vaulted ceilings and murmur half-formed words, as though communing with distant memories he could not articulate. In those moments, he seemed suspended between worlds, neither fully child nor yet king. As autumn turned to winter and the winds off the Manzanares grew biting, Charles's health waxed and waned like the phases of the moon. On good days, he would be wheeled into the sunlit corridors, the warmth of the glassed-in galleries coaxing a faint blush to his pale cheeks. On other days, the slightest draught would send him into fits of coughing, and he would retreat to his chamber, curtains drawn against the world. By the time he reached his 6th year, the bells of the royal alcazar tolled differently for him, each chime a reminder of the precariousness of his fragile life. No parade or tournament could dispel the truth etched into his small, aching frame that he was, from the moment of his birth, a living testament to the perils of blood so closely kept. And yet, in the gentle hush that followed each bell's echo, there remained a quiet dignity in his survival, a silent resilience beneath the weight of a legacy too burdensome to bear. At ages 6 to 8, Charles II of Spain became little more than a test subject for every epidemic that swept through the royal court. Measles, chickenpox, mumps, and influenza struck him in turn, each contagion compounding the last and leaving his frail body ever more exhausted. The measles covered his face in angry red blotches. The chickenpox erupted again and again, until his skin was a quilt of weeping sores. The mumps swelled his cheeks painfully, and the flu left him coughing and gasping for breath long after the fever broke. But the cruelest blow came when he was 9 years old. A devastating smallpox outbreak marred an already malformed visage with pockmarks and cratered scars. Those who had once whispered of his uncanny deformities now recoiled at the ruin of his features. His days became a blur of illness and pain, a relentless cycle of healing ointments and ritualistic inoculations, primitive mixtures of herbs, rose water, and cow's blood administered by physicians who whispered of curses as they plied their crude remedies. As if the ravages of disease were not enough, Charles then fell victim to hydrocephalus, an accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid that pressed upon his brain, causing headaches so fierce that he would clutch his swollen skull and moan in despair. Contemporary physicians deemed it a calamity bestowed upon the prince, and they attempted every measure in their limited arsenal trepanation to relieve pressure. Poultices of warmed oils upon his temples, frigid compresses to stave off the swelling, yet none could stem the tide of fluid that distended his head, making it ever more asymmetrical and compressing the very matter that governed thought. It was as if his skull had become a vice, squeezing the fragile machinery of his mind. By the age of 10, Charles's education was the subject of anxious gossip throughout the Alcazar. The finest tutors in Spain were summoned to his bedside to offer instruction in arithmetic, history, and the lofty Latin of diplomacy. They taught with patience and erudition, but their lessons vanished as quickly as they were imparted. In the private journal of one instructor, a weary note reads, "The prince exerts himself greatly. I repeat a lesson thrice, yet by the morrow it is as though he has never heard it. He sits for hours, gazing into the distance, unable to articulate a single coherent thought. His mind, perpetually blurred by pressure and illness, retained nothing but an empty fog. Compounding his cognitive struggles were sensory deficits born of his congenital malformations. His vision grew dimmer by the month, the malformed bones around his temples, distorting light and shading his world in perpetual dusk. His left ear, compressed by the abnormal shape of his skull, barely perceived the softest whisper. Courtiers fretted if the future monarch could neither see nor hear the crucial discourses of state. How could he possibly govern an empire that spanned from the streets of Madrid to the mines of Peru and the jungles of the Philippines? Ambassadors and vassals alike wondered whether the child they presented in lavish ceremonies was destined for the throne or for a legacy of mere token rule. Yet perhaps the darkest chapter awaited in the realm of maturity adolescence, that rite of passage through which boys become men, simply never came to Charles. While his peers shot up in height, his frame remained diminutive, his voice unchanged and pitched unnaturally high. Facial hair failed to sprout, muscles languished in weakness, and the miracle of puberty eluded him entirely. He remained a child in body and spirit, even as his title demanded the gravitas of manhood. To the court's dismay, there was no hint of growth in the prince's underdeveloped body, no promise of heirs to continue the Habsburg lineage. Faced with this crisis of succession, the royal council orchestrated a political marriage to secure the dynasty's future. They chose Marie-Louise of Orléans, a 17-year-old French princess renowned for her health, her beauty, and her generous dowry. On their wedding night, the hope and dread intertwined in the candlelit chambers of the Escorial. But the union quickly proved a nightmare. Charles, entirely impotent, lay beside his radiant bride, like a withered statue. Marie-Louise, poised and patient, attempted with the tenderness of newlywed innocence. But nature refused to cooperate. The contrast was tragic. A vibrant young woman, forced into a role she could not fulfill, and a prince, crippled by inheritance, rendered impotent by the very blood that was meant to sustain him. Court eyewitnesses described the scene with hushed embarrassment. Noble women curtsied stiffly as the newlyweds processed through torchlit halls. Noblemen averted their eyes. Servants whispered of Marie-Louise's tears and of Charles's silent despair. Even the most hardened courtiers felt the weight of personal humiliation borne by their sovereign. From that night onward, the shadow of his impotence hung over every diplomatic reception and royal decree. The empire waited, breath held, for an heir who would never come. Thus, the Habsburg lament continued. Charles's childhood, already mired in disease and pain, culminated in a marriage that revealed the ultimate genetic catastrophe, a body and soul incapable of fulfilling the cardinal duty of procreation. As the champagne and candelabras of the wedding feast dimmed, the grim reality settled over the throne. The greatest empire in Europe would soon face a succession crisis. Not from war or revolution, but from the collapse of a dynasty's own bloodline. And so, amid fine silks and gilded balconies, the fate of Spain was sealed by a child born to die alone. An heir who, from his first breath to his final hour, embodied the tragic irony of royal purity. The early years of Charles's marriages unfolded as a series of humiliating failures. In an age when royal alliances were expected to secure dynastic futures, he and his first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, pursued every imaginable remedy. They consumed concoctions made from pearl powder, bovine blood, and powdered staghorn. Believing that such exotic substances might restore his vigor, physicians employed bizarre treatments drawn from medieval manuscripts, leeches applied to his temples, ointments of nightshade and henbane, even the ingestion of crushed gemstones, all in hopes of awakening dormant potency. When these pharmacopoeial experiments proved futile, the court turned to magic fortune-tellers and tumblers, astrologers and charlatans, each summoned to weave spells or forecast a sudden cure. Yet every ritual, however elaborate, ended in fresh disappointment and public shame. Marie-Louise endured invasive examinations to prove her fertility, her virtue questioned by jealous courtiers, only to discover that the true cause lay not with her, but with Charles himself, whose body remained tragically incapable of conceiving an heir. As the last ember of dynastic hope flickered, Queen Mariana, Charles's mother, and the empire's grand matriarch, succumbed to despair. No remedy seemed too outlandish to try. She decreed that her son should sleep beside the exhumed remains of revered saints and past monarchs, convinced that the saintly essences clinging to those ancient bones might imbue him with fresh life. Thus, on cold stone slabs in the palace crypt, the small, drooling figure of the king would lie beside decaying corpses, the air thick with incense and the stench of embalming spices. This grotesque scene, the prince in nightclothes, his thin frame flickering under torchlight, drool pooling on rotting shrouds, stood as the starkest testament to the depths of courtly superstition and the desperation that had overtaken even the most powerful figures in Madrid. 5 years into their union, at the age of 26, Marie-Louise fell gravely ill and died. The official cause was appendicitis, though rumours of poisoning or suicide swirled through the corridors of power. For Charles, her passing brought genuine grief. She had been the only soul to show him kindness untarnished by dynastic expectation. Yet mourning could not delay political necessity. Within months, the Council of Regency arranged a second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess famed for bearing numerous children across 2 houses. His advisers believed her robust lineage might counteract the Habsburg curse. Mariana arrived in Spain amid festive fanfares, but the result echoed the earlier tragedy. Despite her youth and health, she too failed to conceive. The dynastic pressure gave way to collective sorrow, as once hopeful courtiers beheld a second wedding night that yielded no promise of progeny. By the time Charles reached his 30th year, his body had become a ruin. Patches of hair fell from his scalp, leaving bald fields atop his head. His teeth, already misaligned by the infamous Habsburg jaw, rotted and crumbled away, forcing him to subsist on pureed meats and bland porridges. His skin, marked by pox scars and uneven pigmentation, hung in folds over his gaunt frame. His legs trembled and buckled beneath him. Even a brief appearance at court could trigger a convulsive fall. Seizures struck without warning. He would collapse mid-sentence, foam at the lips, unrecognizable to the very pages who had known him since infancy. In moments of semi-lucidity, he spoke of hearing celestial choirs and infernal whispers, of invisible hands brushing against his flesh. Whispers spread that he was El Hechizado, the bewitched one, a monarch haunted by demons rather than guided by reason. Faced with the undeniable deterioration of their sovereign, the courtiers of Spain and the Council of State pored over report after report from the king's physicians. Page after page documented fevers, unbroken by medicine, the relentless swelling of his hydrocephalic skull, the absence of heirs, and the violent tremors that racked his bones. Political leaders, who once clung to hope for a healthy prince, now confronted the grim truth. Their king was too feeble to govern, and biologically incapable of fathering an heir. Yet irony laced the tragedy. Charles's suffering would outlive him as a cautionary tale. His life, a living experiment in the perils of consanguinity, became the whispered lesson in every European court on the dangers of incestuous marriage. Thus concluded the final chapter of his personal saga. The once radiant ceremonies and gilded corridors of the Alcazar now played host to hushed rumors and sorrowful prayers. Scholars and aristocrats alike would cite his name for generations as evidence of genetic folly. Though his reign yielded no triumphant conquests or lasting reforms, Charles II's legacy endured in the annals of history as perhaps the starkest warning about the price of clinging too closely to bloodlines. In his frail, epileptic body, the Habsburg dynasty's most terrible experiment had laid bare the truth that no throne, however grand, can withstand the relentless forces of inherited fate. After the ignominious collapse of his two marriages, Charles II began a slow descent into physical and mental desolation. In body, he spent ever more time confined to bed, his legs drawn up in unrelenting cramps, his limbs trembling as though seized by unseen forces, his frail frame incapable of rising under its own weight. Seizures beset him with alarming frequency. He would collapse mid-ceremony, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth, his eyes rolling upward until he no longer recognized the familiar faces of his servants or courtiers. When he finally returned to consciousness, he often mumbled of distant shadows and half-heard voices whispering in his ear, as if unseen phantoms roamed the palace halls with him in his delirium. On the mental front, Charles became convinced that he was under a terrible curse. In their desperation, Queen Mariana and her advisors carried him from shrine to shrine throughout Christendom. He was wrapped in the ash of saintly bones, spun around reliquaries that held the dust of past kings, and made to lie beside the sarcophagi of bishops, all in the hope that a spark of divine grace might animate his broken body. He wore amulets at his neck, clung to crucifixes of holy silver, and endured purification rites in which robed chanters ritually chanted over him. Yet not a single rite could penetrate the fortress of his genetic ruin. Meanwhile, the very foundations of Spanish governance trembled beneath the weight of his incapacity. Without offspring to secure the lineage, and without health to engage in any diplomatic mission or patriotic pageant, the realm's nobles began to plot and bargain behind closed doors. From the courts of the Holy Roman Emperor to the drawing rooms of Versailles and the palaces of Westminster, foreign powers, negotiated for marriages that would seize upon Spain's weakened throne, but none truly dared to invest in the ill-fated prince, whose very existence portended dynastic collapse. Within the Alcazar's gilded chambers, Spain's once mighty court unravelled. In name, Charles II retained the crown. In practice, he was mockingly called the Little King by those who remembered his early years of promise. The intricate charters and edicts issued in his name were in truth the handiwork of the learned grandees and the secretive Council of State. By candlelight, these men of power annotated his decrees and directed the empire's affairs as though it were a puppet show. The prince's name, merely a marionette dancing atop their strings. Inevitably, the twin tragedies of Charles's childlessness and misrule cast a pall over every noble gathering. Whispers circulated. Might the monarchy's centuries-old doctrine of absolute succession be obsolete? A folly to be abandoned in favour of a more stable arrangement. The question, once unthinkable, took root in the hushed corridors where statesmen whispered of regencies, shared rule, or even the dissolution of Spain's overseas dominions should a true heir never emerge. From dusty council chambers to candlelit chapels, Charles II's presence grew ever more spectral. He attended state ceremonies behind embroidered draperies, a distant silhouette unseen by the public eye. His voice, once intended to carry the weight of empire, was but a tremor lost in the vaulted ceilings of the royal chapel. All that remained for his contemporaries was the image of a fragile prince, endured by duty, haunted by the self-same blood that had once promised greatness. Thus did the final years of Charles II's life unfurl into a bleak testament, a majestic crown worn by an infirm man whose lineage, once the envy of Europe, had become its most tragic cautionary tale. The court's laughter faded into uncomfortable silence. The trumpets of royal fanfare surrendered to the rustle of fearful glances. In the end, the story of Spain's little king was whispered not as a tale of triumph, but as a hush of mourning for a dynasty undone by its own quest for purity, for a prince who bore the heavy price of inbreeding, and for a kingdom left bereft of future sons under the shattered cross of Habsburg misfortune. When Charles turned 30, the decline of his health reached its most tragic depths. Patches of hair fell from his scalp in clusters, leaving barren spots that revealed his pale, bony head. His once taut skin had slackened into folds, each wrinkle a testament to the relentless passage of disease. His face, already hollow beneath the protruding jaw, grew gaunt and drawn, as though some cruel artist had carved away the flesh to expose the skull beneath. His teeth, misaligned from birth and ravaged by age, rotted in his mouth, sending rivulets of blood and saliva down his chin. The palace physicians installed vessels of cotton swabs and fine linen handkerchiefs at his bedside, but even such ministrations could scarcely keep pace with the constant flow of tears and drool. More alarming still were the convulsions that seized him without warning. In the hushed grandeur of an audience chamber, he might suddenly collapse, limbs contorting in violent spasms, white froth bubbling at the corners of his mouth. Courtier gasped. The hush, broken by muffled cries, as attendants rushed forward to catch him before he struck the marble floor. When consciousness returned, his eyes would flutter open, bewildered and glazed, as though he had awoken from a tormenting dream. He often did not recognize the same pages and bodyguards who had tended him since infancy. In his delirium, he pleaded with God to forgive sins. He believed he had committed phantom transgressions, born of superstition and of a deep-seated shame at his very existence. Word of the king's fearful condition spread beyond palace walls into the streets of Madrid. At public festivals, whispers followed his gilded sedan chair. There goes the maimed prince, the common folk muttered, pointing at his gaunt profile. They spoke of his trembling hands, his sudden falls, and the legends of the Habsburg curse that clung to his name like a shadow. Print shops in Paris and London produced pamphlets with woodcuts of his distorted visage, labelling him the bewitched monarch, the drooling sinner, a living tragedy on display for European courts and taverns alike. In every capital from Vienna to Versailles, Paris to London, Charles became synonymous with feebleness, his fate cited as a dire warning against unchecked inbreeding. Desperate to find a cure, the court dispatched emissaries to recruit the finest physicians across Europe. From England came a renowned apothecary who bore nightly vials of herbal tonics distilled from eastern roots. From France travelled a surgeon versed in the latest anatomical treatises, accompanied by leather-bound tomes of Galenic medicine. From Italy arrived a master of mineral therapeutics, with jars of rare salts and powdered gems. Each doctor was granted a grand audience, robes brushed with gold, as they examined Charles under glimmering chandeliers. Yet in every consultation, they confronted the cruel reality. His pituitary gland was inert, his kidneys failing, his bones brittle from metabolic imbalance. His liver had become a scarred husk, laid low by the constant potions and purges prescribed in earlier years. The final hope lay in an experimental pituitary graft, a technique barely contemplated by 17th century science. In a clandestine operation, surgeons donned stained leather masks and crude metal instruments in a dimly lit ward. They trepanned a small hole in Charles's skull, seeking to replace the crippled gland with transplanted tissue from a recently deceased subject of noble birth. The operation, shadowed by fear and superstition, seemed more ritual than science. For weeks afterward, Charles lay bandaged and listless, his head throbbing with infection. The court sealed the chamber doors, barring all but a handful of confidants from the king's presence, and the outside world could only listen for the distant clinking of beakers and the soft mutter of prayers from the chapel across the hall. When at last it became clear that even this radical procedure had failed, the palace sank into a sombre quiet. Charles, grievously weakened by surgery and months of fever, withdrew into solitude. No longer did he grace the balconies or receive ambassadors. Instead, he spent hours alone in a small studio lined with ancient tomes and half-finished canvases. There he attempted to sketch the world. He could no longer engage a few watercolour silhouettes of cypress trees, some faded heraldic shields, a solitary crown abandoned upon a velvet cushion. The brush felt heavy in his trembling hand, and more often than not he would set it aside, closing his eyes as if to let the colours swirl behind his lids. In those final years, the corridors echoed with the memory of his laughter, now gone. On rare occasions, a servant would glimpse the ghost of the young boy who once clutched his nurse's gown, marvelling at the vast palace gardens. But most witnesses saw only a shadow passing behind drawn curtains, a pale outline of a man who had once held the world in his grasp. His name on official proclamations remained, yet the substance of his reign was nothing more than a fading echo. The portraits grew fewer and ever more stylized, painters deliberately softening his features so that his cruel deformities might be forgotten by future generations. And so, as the candles guttered low in the Alcazar's great halls, the kingdom learned to live without its monarch. The concept of a fully sovereign king, deeply feared, endlessly praised, gave way to a more tempered governance. Councils of nobles and ministers rose to fill the void, establishing precedents that would shape Spain's future long after Charles's final breath. Yet the hush that fell over the capital at the news of his passing bore witness to the enduring power of his tragic saga. Even in death, Charles II remained a symbol, a cautionary tale of ambition unchecked by nature, of dynastic pride undone by the very blood meant to sustain it, and of a man who, for all his grandeur, could not escape the chambers of his own frailty. When Princess Marie-Louise of Orléans passed away in 1689, and soon thereafter, Princess Maria Anna of Neuburg also proved unable to bear children, every last glimmer of hope for a Habsburg heir flickered into darkness. Spain's vast empire, stretching from the sun-drenched streets of Madrid to the silver mines of Peru, from the Philippines to the Caribbean islands, stood perilously close to what courtiers whispered as tuet-tur. a total extinction of lineage. In hidden chambers, the Council of State and the king's most trusted advisors exchanged anxious glances, fearing that the Bourbon branch of the French royal family would seize this moment of weakness and claim the Spanish crown, thus, without so much as a murmur from the ailing monarch himself. Whispers of the impending war of the Spanish succession began to take shape, igniting the fuse of a conflict destined to embroil all of Europe. Charles II, once the cherished spring blossom of the Habsburg tree, was now little more than a shadow on his own throne. Housebound by illness, he lay listless upon his great canopy bed, surrounded by piles of parchment, bearing his trembling signature, barely more than a scrawl administered by a scribe who guided his quill. His presence at court ceremonies dwindled to mere legend. He became a walking emblem of dynastic decay, a cautionary figure demonstrating the fatal result of generations spent pursuing pure blood, as foreign courts sharpened their diplomatic swords and marshalled troops along borders. Inside the palace walls, Spanish grandees formed rival factions, each maneuvering to claim influence over the throne's weak occupant. Spain's neighbours prepared for conflict. Spain itself divided into camps of intrigue and ambition. By the dawn of the 18th century, desperation overcame discretion. The royal physicians resolved on a final, ruthless intervention. In a sealed chamber of the palace infirmary, they would perform an in vivo autopsy, examining the sovereign's skull and internal organs while he still lay alive. Physicians donned their stained masks and summoned instruments fashioned from steel, glass, and bone. As the king reclined, pale as marble, they trepaned his cranium, releasing torrents of yellowed cerebrospinal fluid. When they probed his brain, they recoiled in horror. Hydrocephalus had shattered much of the neural tissue, compressing his mind into a fragile sliver. Beneath his ribs, his kidneys, once meant to filter the lifeblood of an empire, had shriveled to pebble-sized nodules, incapable of purifying more than the faintest trickle of blood. The heart, that tireless pump of sovereignty, lay the size of a garden pea, blackened and contracted. His lungs, hard as battered cloth, bore the scars of repeated infections and centuries of inbreeding. Even his intestines bore segments of gangrene, as though death had gnawed at him from within while he still drew breath. Most ghastly of all, the physicians noted that his circulatory system contained scarcely a drop of liquid blood, his life ebbing away until his body became a dry husk. Though the details of this morbid inquiry were sealed within the palace, rumour spread like wildfire through Spain's towns and villages. Barbers and apothecaries spoke of the king's shattered skull and the ruin of his organs, warning of the dangers of incestuous unions. Universities and guilds of medicine in Madrid, Granada, and Salamanca recorded the case in secret manuscripts, and by the late 17th century, treatises began to circulate discreetly among Europe's learned societies. The death of Charles the Bewitched is a dire admonition against the abuse of inbreeding, proclaimed one anonymous pamphlet. Its woodcut illustrations depicting the fluid-filled skull, the peppercorn heart, and the shriveled kidneys. Such diagrams, deliberate and meticulous, became instructive models for generations of students studying anatomy and pathology. Fearing panic among his subjects, the Spanish government moved swiftly to control the narrative. They issued a brief proclamation, attributing the king's passing to severe dysentery, a malady far more common and less stigmatizing than the brutal truth. On a somber morning, the cortege carried his body to the royal pantheon of El Escorial, the massive monastery fortress that was his final resting place. Commoners spoke afterward of a foul odour seeping from the tomb, of tear-shaped droplets forming upon the lead-lined coffin. Rumour grew into legend. They said that on certain misty dawns, mournful sobs echoed through the marble chapels, and a phantom procession of scribes could be glimpsed weeping at the unlit candles. More than 2 centuries passed before the advent of modern genetic science shed definitive light on Charles II's plight. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as researchers gained access to minuscule tissue samples and skeletal remains, They calculated his inbreeding coefficient at 0.254, surpassing even the theoretical offspring of sibling unions. They identified the twin catastrophes that had so ravaged his body, a combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which explained his dwarfed stature, cognitive impairments, and failure of sexual maturation, and distal renal tubular acidosis, which accounted for his rickets, muscle weakness, and possibly contributed to the hydrocephalus that had swollen his skull. When these conditions intertwined with the notorious Habsburg mandibular prognathism, his lower jaw jutting forward in grotesque prominence, the result was a perfect storm of genetic disaster. Today, students of genetics learn of Charles II as a cautionary tale etched into the very blueprint of human inheritance. His life and death stand as stark evidence of the perils of a closed gene pool, of ambition carried to a deadly extreme. In the silent halls of the Museo del Prado, where his portraits hang with anguished solemnity, visitors pause before the painted boy-king, his mouth slightly agape, all illusion of sovereign grandeur stripped away. In his eyes, one sees not only the reflection of a failing dynasty, but the broader lesson that biology holds a final verdict: no throne can overrule. Charles II's story remains a tragic monument to the truth that, in the end, the sanctity of life depends not on the purity of blood, but on the diversity of the genes we carry. After Charles II's death in the year 1700, the Spanish crown lay vacant, its lineage extinct in the direct male line. In the weeks that followed, the fragile peace of Europe shattered into open conflict. The War of the Spanish Succession began a 13-year struggle that pitted the Habsburg Archduchy of Austria against the Bourbon monarchy of France. With England and the Dutch Republic aligning with Austria to contain French ambitions, Spain itself, once the jewel of a global empire, found its towns and fields turned to battlefields. From the ragged hills of Catalonia to the plazas of Madrid, cannon smoke rose above shattered churches. Across the Atlantic, the colonies in South America, Peru, New Granada, the silver-rich veins of Potosi, erupted in rebellion and opportunism, as local governors seized temporary autonomy, while imperial ships were diverted for war. Even the distant island of Luzon in the Philippines braced for raids, its fortifications hastily reinforced against privateers emboldened by Spain's weakened state. In the salons and lecture halls of European universities, the spectre of Charles II became a subject of intense scrutiny. Medical professors at Padua, Leiden, and Paris began citing the inbreeding coefficient as a fundamental concept in hereditary studies. They contrasted the catastrophic outcome of the Habsburgs' incestuous unions with more outbred lineages, demonstrating how the accumulation of identical genes could lead to dire physiological collapse. As the Bourbon dynasty ascended the Spanish throne under Philip V, its members deliberately sought spouses from distant royal houses: Portugal, Saxony, Savoy, even the distant courts of Scandinavia, ensuring that the genetic pool remained broad and resilient. In this way, Bourbon strategists learned from the Habsburg tragedy, weaving alliances that spread Spanish blood into diverse European families, rather than confining it within a narrow circle. On the broader cultural stage, the Habsburg jaw took on mythic proportions. Opera libretti in Vienna recounted the tale of the two-faced prince whose very appearance foretold doom. In the gilded theatres of Paris, playwrights dramatized his plight in tragedies filled with sprawling monologues about fate and heredity. Romantic poets of 19th century France, their quills dipped in melancholic ink, composed verses mourning the twin faces of youth trapped in decay. In countless museums, portraits of Charles II paintings that once served to glorify the royal line now hung as stark reminders of the human cost of dynastic pride. Visitors paused before these canvases, their eyes drawn to the slightly open mouth, the melancholic gaze, and the pronounced chin jutting forward like a silent testament to blood so closely kept. The pull of Charles's story reached even into the laboratories of modern science. In 2010, A team of geneticists and forensic anthropologists secured permission to extract DNA samples from his burial site at El Escorial. Their analyses confirmed the once suspected deficit in pituitary function, combined pituitary hormone deficiency, alongside the markers of renal tubular acidosis that had afflicted his kidneys. But more illuminating was the discovery of gene mutations associated with lysosomal storage diseases, hinting that a third, rarer disorder had contributed to his progressive decline. These findings, published in a series of peer-reviewed journals, cemented Charles II's case as a triad of genetic calamities: endocrine failure, kidney dysfunction, and abnormal cellular metabolism. The scholarly community hailed the research as a poignant example of how historical figures can illuminate modern medicine, offering clear genetic correlates for centuries-old clinical observations. Yet perhaps the most enduring lesson from the Habsburg saga is not confined to royalty or even to human medicine. Conservation biologists and wildlife managers around the globe now routinely calculate inbreeding coefficients to safeguard endangered species, whether breeding Siberian tigers in captivity or managing orphaned populations of Galapagos tortoises. They understand that a healthy gene pool requires sufficient diversity to confer resistance to disease and adaptability to environmental change. In zoos and wildlife reserves, breeding programs are guided by pedigree analyses and genetic screening, ensuring that no population becomes too closely related. In agricultural contexts, seed banks preserve heirloom crops with diverse lineages to protect against famine and pathogen outbreaks. All of these efforts, rooted in the catastrophic example of Charles II, underscore the truth that genetic homogeneity carries dire risks. In quiet moments, one can almost envision Charles's spectral form wandering the corridors of El Escorial, a frail monarch whose silent suffering resonates across the centuries. His life, marred by illness and isolation, became a powerful narrative woven into the fabric of political history, medical science, and conservation ethics. He stands as a reminder that no amount of prestige, wealth, or divine right can override the fundamental laws of biology. In the hush of museum galleries and the meticulous pages of modern textbooks, the tragedy of Charles II endures, teaching us that our greatest strength lies not in the purity of our blood, but in the shared richness of our diversity. Thus, the legacy of a king who died without heirs has shaped how we understand heredity, health, and the delicate balance that sustains all living things on this planet, echoing through time as a somber lullaby, urging us to remember that nature's final decree is inescapable. Charles II was not merely a tragic victim of his family's bloodlines. He left a profound legacy in both history and science. Politically, his death in the year 1700, without a male heir, brought the centuries-long Spanish Habsburg dynasty to a close, clearing the path for the Bourbons to ascend the throne. The new Bourbon monarchs, wary of repeating the genetic follies of their predecessors, forged marital alliances with far-flung royal families from Portugal to Saxony, from Savoy to the Scandinavian courts, ensuring that Spain's rulers would never again confine their blood within such perilous narrow bounds. In this way, the final Habsburg king became a symbol of an empire's ruin, a poignant reminder of how the splendor of a realm can crumble when its rulers cling too tightly to pure lineage. From a medical perspective, Charles's case stands out among historical figures for the unparalleled depth of documentation. Physicians recorded his every symptom, from his infantile struggles to his adult convulsions. They painstakingly logged each experimental treatment, whether herbal elixirs or mystical rites, and they spared no detail in the grim post-mortem examinations. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, lectures in Padua, Leiden, and Paris pointed to Charles II's life as a cautionary tale of concentrated genetic mutations wreaking havoc on multiple organ systems: the nervous, endocrine, circulatory, respiratory, digestive, and reproductive alike. His records illustrated the catastrophic endpoints of excessive inbreeding, framing medical curricula for generations to come. Beyond symptomatology, Charles's experience provided a vivid example of the so-called genetic load principle. As successive Habsburg unions piled mutation upon mutation, the dynasty's shared gene pool became a veritable nightmare garden of defects. Unchecked by the diversifying mechanisms that natural selection normally affords, modern genomic analyses later confirmed that over 25% of his genome consisted of identical gene copies, a degree of homozygosity unmatched even by the theoretical offspring of siblings. No natural filter remained to remove the accumulating errors, and the result was a body and mind overwhelmed by the burden of its own heritage. Culturally, the Habsburg jaw transcended mere portraiture to become a potent emblem in European art. During the Renaissance and Baroque eras, painters and sculptors keen to flatter their sovereign's dignity yet constrained by truth often minimized Charles's jaw protrusion in official depictions. Yet today, experts can easily pinpoint the telltale mandibular prognathism across canvases and busts, those slight glares of the lower skull betraying a trait once hidden in plain sight. Opera librettists in Vienna, playwrights in Paris, and poets in 19th century France all wove his tragedy into their works, lamenting the two-faced prince whose very visage was a prophecy of disaster. In enthralling arias and sweeping dramas, artists cast Charles II as a living myth, an heir doomed by the double helix itself. Perhaps the most far-reaching element of Charles's legacy lies in the modern appreciation of biodiversity. Conservation biologists now routinely calculate inbreeding coefficients to guide breeding programs for endangered species, from Siberian tigers in Asian sanctuaries to Galapagos tortoises on remote isles. They understand that a robust gene pool, rich in variation, is the bulwark against disease and the key to adaptability in a changing world. In botanical seed banks that preserve agricultural heirlooms, geneticists track lineage and purposefully cross distant varieties to maintain resilience against blight and climate stress. These practices, all rooted in the tragic example set by the last Habsburg king, underscore the vital truth that diversity is not merely desirable but essential for survival. In the spring of 2010, long after the flickering torches of the Alcazar had faded, a new chapter in his posthumous life began. A team of geneticists and anthropologists obtained microscopic samples from his remains, verifying the combined pituitary hormone deficiency and renal tubular acidosis, once hypothesized by 18th century physicians. Even more remarkable was the discovery of mutations tied to lysosomal storage disorders, rare conditions that further illuminated why his body crumbled under the load of multiple ailments. Published in peer-reviewed journals, these findings established Charles II's case as a genetic triad of endocrine collapse, kidney dysfunction, and cellular storage failure, solidifying his status as a medical lodestar for understanding polygenic disease. Yet beyond the sterile halls of academia and the hushed galleries where his portraits hang, Charles II's story resonates as a quiet lullaby, a reminder that no empire, no matter how grand, is immune to the final verdict of biology. His reign, marked by suffering and solitude, became a living demonstration of the immutable laws of inheritance. As visitors stand before his painted likeness, they see not only a king, but the embodiment of a universal warning that the pursuit of undiluted bloodlines can lead to catastrophe, and that the true strength of any lineage, be it human, animal, or plant, lies in its capacity to embrace diversity. Thus the legacy of Charles II endures, touching fields as varied as political history, clinical medicine, evolutionary biology, and conservation ethics. His life, woven from the dual threads of regal expectation and genetic frailty, echoes through centuries as a testament to the fundamental unity of life on Earth. In the hushed silence of a museum hall or the lively chatter of a genetics conference, his name reminds us that the tapestry of existence is richest when its colours are many, and that nature's final decree, though sombre, guides us toward a future safeguarded by the diverse inheritance we share. As Charles II entered the final decade of his life, the slow unravelling of both body and mind deepened into profound decay. His once sporadic convulsions became relentless seizures, each one snatching him into unconsciousness in the midst of council gatherings and religious ceremonies alike. Afterward, he would lie pale and limp upon a chaise longue, his breathing shallow, his limbs curled inward, as though gripped by invisible claws. His muscles, starved of strength by years of illness and malnutrition, could no longer support even the smallest movement. He sat propped against a high-backed chair, his spine bowed, his limbs contorted and trembling, reliant upon the gentle ministrations of eunuchs and chamberlains merely to clothe his wasted frame or comb the thin strands that remained atop his scalp. Each simple act, pulling a sleeve over a frail arm, threading a button through its hole, rising onto tiptoe to peer down a corridor, required a small army of attendants, their gloved hands guiding him with trembling caution. In those same twilight years, his mind drifted further from the world of the living. He spent hours staring blankly into space, his eyes vacant and unseeing, unresponsive, even when summoned by name. When he did speak, his voice emerged as a hoarse whisper, a reciting of half-formed words meant more for himself than any listener, as though he wandered in a somnambulistic haze. In rare lucid moments, he would tremble and murmur apologies for sins. He claimed to have committed phantom transgressions, born of a superstition that haunted him like a spectre. Convinced that he carried a curse upon his very birth, he fastened upon himself every charm and talisman the court could provide. Around his neck hung jeweled crosses, amulets of silver and gold, bits of bone from saints preserved in crystal reliquaries. He tucked scraps of consecrated parchment into his shirt, and on his wrists he wore cords blessed by priests. Yet no combination of relic or ritual could undo the pattern of decay written into his very genes. By the year 1695, Charles had all but vanished from public view. He retreated into seclusion, a condition whispered about in court as the retreating syndrome. He no longer attended receptions or presided at state audiences. Instead, he received obeisances from behind heavy drapes. His silhouette, barely a wisp of shadow. His private chamber became redolent of medicinal herbs, the pungent scent of mugwort, rue, and valerian mingling with the more heady aroma of smoked incense used to venerate holy relics. Candles burned with a mournful flicker, their wavering light chosen to suit his failing eyesight and to spare him the harsh glare of midday sun. In this dim sanctuary of flickering flame and murmured psalms, he remained isolated, convinced each breath might bring him closer to some unspeakable doom. When a matter of state demanded his sanction, a treaty, a war tax, his ministers placed a fresh parchment before him. He would scrawl a few uncertain strokes of his trembling hand, granting authority that he no longer fully understood. These signatures, mere approximations of his will, became the kingdom's law. The grandees and privy council wielded true power behind the scenes, turning Spain's grand empire into a stage for their own designs. His image as sovereign was preserved, but his agency had long since evaporated. He was a puppet king, the living emblem of a realm on the brink of collapse. Occasionally, painters sought to capture his likeness anew, but skillful brushstrokes and soft shadows could only mask so much of his ravaged countenance. Portraits commissioned in those years show a hollow-eyed monarch, his lips pressed into a thin line, his chin receding beneath the cursed jaw that no amount of artistic flourish could fully conceal. These images, later displayed in the palace's portrait gallery, whispered of a throne nearing its end, each canvas a testament to grace, eroded by sickness and sorrow. As the final years of the 1790s wore on, Charles's nights grew restive and fearful. Sleep eluded him, and his mind became a theatre of horrors. He awoke in terror, flinching at imagined phantoms reaching for him in the darkness. He spoke of hearing whispered voices, chanting forbidden prayers, and of spirits gliding just beyond his sight. He refused to eat the spiced purees once essential to keep his fragile body alive, dreading the taste. And the instruments whittled ivory spoons and iron feeding tubes that scraped against his gums. His appetite vanished, leaving him gaunt beyond belief. His cheeks hollow, his chest caved. By the early months of the year 1700, his condition forced the most sombre of deliberations. The royal physicians and senior ministers convened in secret, weighing the unthinkable options of removal from the throne or appointment of a regency to govern in his name. Outside the palace walls, rumour swelled among the populace. Was their king truly fit to rule? Could he bear the burdens of sovereignty? The court, ever protective of royal dignity, imposed a strict veil of silence around his plight. State papers continued to bear his name, but his true state remained concealed behind mahogany doors and hushed corridors. Only weeks before his earthly departure, those fortunate few permitted entry to his chamber witnessed a fragile scene. Charles, his voice a mere breath, kneeling by the marble tomb of Marie-Louise, the only wife who had shown him genuine compassion. He muttered prayers, pressing a worn silk kerchief to the cold stone, his lips paling with each recitation. It was as though, in the final twilight of his existence, he sought solace in a love that death alone could not claim. Then, in the still hours of a spring dawn, his tormented breathing stilled, and Charles II drew his final, laboured breath. Thus ended the sombre chronicle of a king born to grandeur, but destined for tragedy, a reign marked not by victories or splendour, but by suffering, silence, and the inexorable decline of a once proud dynasty. And in that hushed moment of passing, the palace seemed to exhale its collective grief, as though the very stones mourned the demise of Spain's last Habsburg monarch. On the first day of November in the year 1700, the fragile thread of Charles II's life finally snapped. He passed away after a prolonged illness, his breath fading in the half-light of his chamber as candle wicks guttered in solemn vigil. News of his death spread swiftly through the marble corridors of the royal Alcazar in Madrid. Before dawn's first grey light, the Council of State issued a discreet summons for a secret post-mortem examination within the cloistered confines of a dimly lit crypt. Royal physicians gathered under flickering lanterns, their faces grave as they prepared to confront the ultimate enigma of the ill-fated king. Carefully, they broke the royal seal on his ebony coffin and laid the stiffened body upon a stone slab. Scraps of velvet robes were cast aside as the surgeons, wearing soot-stained masks, lifted the covering to expose the cadaver's gaunt frame. With trembling hands, they made their first incisions, revealing a horror that exceeded even their darkest forebodings. Their dry, Latin-penned report, burdened with clinical detachment yet betraying echoes of shock, would later be filed in the kingdom's most secret archives. The initial revelation was that the king's body contained not a single drop of fresh blood. The physicians noted that the plasma had either congealed into dark clots or vanished altogether, leaving a sponge-like hollow within the veins. As they probed deeper, they discovered his heart reduced to the size of a mustard seed, shriveled, blackened, and inert, incapable of more than a faint throb, even in life. The muscle fibers, once the source of regal vitality, lay sallow, scarring the chamber with an odour of charred tissue. His lungs, too, betrayed a lifetime of affliction. The fine lacework of alveoli had been replaced by fibrous, unyielding bands that neither expanded nor contracted. Evidence of repeated bouts of pneumonia that left him gasping for air even in his earliest years. Every inhalation in life must have been a battle, now. They lay splayed open beneath the surgeon's lanterns, a testament to the relentless strain he endured. Beneath the diaphragm, the liver appeared no more vibrant than coal, its once robust lobes shrunk and dark. Signs of chronic toxin exposure from decades of herbal potions and metallic elixirs The kidneys presented as shriveled spheres, pocked with lesions and scar tissue, incapable of filtering even a droplet of blood. They held within them stones of crystalline grit, formed over years of acidic imbalance, each calculus a silent witness to his body's slow collapse. Turning to the digestive tract, the surgeons found vast swathes of necrotic tissue lining the small intestine and colon. Segments of bowel had succumbed to gangrene, leaving cavities festering with decay. Even in life, these rotting patches would have caused agonizing cramps and perpetual malabsorption, condemning him to a state of chronic starvation despite any sustenance forced into his feeding tube. Yet the most striking discovery came as they examined his nether region. One single testicle, blackened as burnt coal. The Latin notes declared an unequivocal sign of sterility. This solitary, atrophied organ stood as the final proof that 2 royal marriages had failed, not for want of effort, but for biological impossibility. Here lay the root of the Habsburg dynasty's ultimate undoing: an heirless king, his line extinguished by his very flesh. But the scholars had left their most gruesome labour for last. With delicate trepanation, they opened Charles's skull to expose the morbid surprise of hydrocephalus. The cavity gushed forth rancid fluid, a murky yellow tide that had long clogged his brain's precious architecture. What remained of his cerebral tissue was pressed thin against the bone. A wafer-like label of grey matter, stretched to its limit. A court artist, summoned in secret, later sketched the grotesque scene. The skull fractured in places where surgeons had attempted relief. The blockages of fluid clearly charted. The tiny depression where his pituitary gland should have stood entirely hollowed out. In the final annotation, the physicians recorded that the pituitary was utterly non-functional, explaining in perfect medical terseness the collapse of his growth, his sexual stunting, and the myriad hormonal catastrophes that had plagued him. That record, hastily summarized into a leaner manuscript, was stowed away in the royal archives. Sealed behind multiple vaults, a handful of whispered copies was smuggled out over the decades. But the full, chilling details did not reach Europe's medical community until well into the 19th century. Then, at the Medical University of Madrid, aspiring physicians pored over these pages, using Charles II's autopsy as a gallery of pathological extremes, a living atlas of what happens when genetic isolation spirals into systemic failure. Upon receiving the post-mortem findings, the Council of State submitted a formal petition to the Crown Council. They urged that the principle of absolute hereditary monarchy be re-examined, for their king was both impotent and incapacitated. Yet loyalty to tradition held sway. Publicly, they proclaimed the succession secure, inviting the House of Bourbon to assume the scepter, without acknowledging the true reason: a king whose body had proven too broken to yield progeny or govern in spirit. Thus, in hushed corridors, the last Habsburg reign gave way to a new chapter in Spain's history, one written not with royal blood, but with the stark lessons of science and the sombre whispers of political necessity. Upon the passing of Charles II on the 1st of November in the year 1700, the Spanish throne lay vacated by a king without heir. Almost at once, the embers of conflict flared into the War of the Spanish Succession, a drawn-out struggle lasting from 1701 until 1714. Across the continent, great houses, Habsburg Austria, Bourbon France, the kingdoms of England and the Dutch Republic, and sundry lesser states aligned into opposing coalitions. From the flat fields of Flanders to the rolling hills of Lombardy, armies marched. Sieges ground on for months under bleak winter skies, and the clang of steel and roar of cannon fire echoed through shattered towns. The coffers of each realm ran dangerously low. Countless lives were lost in pitched battles and protracted sieges. As Europe's rulers reckoned that the Spanish crown's fate was worth the price of blood and treasure, within Spain itself, scarcely a moment of tranquility remained. The populace, already haunted by memories of the deformed heir, and shocked by the mystery surrounding his death, grew increasingly suspicious of the Habsburg claim to divine right. In Madrid and Seville alike, crowds gathered in the streets, torchlight flickering off painted storefronts as they burned effigies of pale Charles. The blue-lipped king, whose spectral visage once haunted palace corridors, peasants and city dwellers alike demanded reform, questioning whether an absolute hereditary monarchy was still suitable for a nation so clearly betrayed by its last scion. Far from the sunlit plazas of central Spain, in the cold courts of Vienna, Empress Maria Anna of Neuburg, the second wife of Charles II, was stripped of her royal insignia. Although spared the fate of exile, she was compelled to retreat to her familial seat in the Austrian capital, a reluctant spectre of dynastic change. Beyond the European battlefields, Spain's vast overseas empire trembled under the shock of war. In New Spain, today's Mexico, the viceroy enforced martial law as local militias fought both foreign invaders and rebellious subjects seeking to carve out their own fiefdoms. In the silver-rich highlands of Peru, governors took oaths of loyalty alternately to Bourbon or Habsburg claimants. Depending on the latest rumor of a passing ship, some towns declared autonomy altogether, seizing arms and forming irregular militias. Missionaries, who had traversed jungles and deserts to bring salvation to indigenous populations, found their work interrupted. Churches fell silent, pulpits vacant, and the catechism gave way to the rattle of musket fire. The once steady flow of wealth from the New World to Cadiz slowed to a trickle. Shiploads of bullion and cocoa, capsized by privateers or seized by rebel governors. The galleons that once linked Manila's harbour to Veracruz and Lima to Cadiz now sailed under perilous escort, their holds half empty, their routes fraught with danger. At last, weary of endless war and the drain it placed upon all participants, European statesmen gathered in the spring of 1713 to negotiate peace. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed amid hush and ceremony, recognized Philip of Bourbon as King Philip V of Spain. While curbing France's designs upon the continent, Flanders and the rich provinces of the Low Countries passed to the Habsburg Archduchy of Austria, while the British Crown secured strategic enclaves, such as Gibraltar and Minorca, ensuring that the Mediterranean would never again remain wholly under Bourbon sway. As the diplomats affixed their seals and toasted to lasting peace, Spain, under its new Bourbon king, began a cautious revival. Philip V, the first Bourbon monarch of Spain, embraced a series of reforms aimed at restoring his kingdom's fortunes. He reorganized the army along modern lines, adopting the training methods and drilling standards that had given Prussian and Austrian forces their renown. He overhauled the customs service, streamlining ports and reducing corrupt toll collectors who had long siphoned off the empire's revenue. Education, once the province of narrow religious orders, was expanded through the founding of new academies and the revision of curricula to include Enlightenment-inspired subjects, mathematics, natural philosophy, and modern languages replaced rote learning in Latin. These reforms laid the groundwork for a Spain more enlightened and better equipped to navigate the challenges of a new century. Yet, for all these outward changes, the deeper spectre of Charles II's ordeal continued to haunt European nobility. His life and death had reverberated as a stark warning of the perils of closed gene pools. From Stockholm to Lisbon, Joachim von Brandenburg to Victor Amadeus of Savoy, princely houses now chose brides from distant dynasties rather than from within their own circle. Letters and marriage contracts explicitly sought to broaden alliances across national borders, French princesses to British princes, Polish nobles to Austrian archduchesses, each match a deliberate step toward genetic diversity. The phrase Habsburg jaw lingered in whispered conversations as a metaphor not only for physical deformity, but also for political and biological folly. Into the modern era, conservationists would come to cite Charles II's case in their own brand of succession planning. Zoologists studying the bottlenecked populations of Iberian lynx or northern white rhinos began to calculate inbreeding coefficients before arranging breeding pairs. lest they unconsciously repeat the mistakes of Europe's grandest dynasty. Similarly, agricultural scientists safeguarding heirloom crops observed that genetic variety was the bulwark against blight and pestilence. In studies of small populations, whether of tigers in Indian reserves or condors in Californian canyons, the concept of genetic load loomed large, a bitter echo of the emptiness left by Charles II's failed lineage. Thus, even as the brutal echoes of the War of the Spanish Succession faded and the Bourbon dynasty settled into its new reign, the shadow of Spain's last Habsburg king persisted. His troubled life, a confluence of regal expectation and genetic tragedy, transformed into a lasting lesson in the value of diversity in blood, in politics, and in the wider tapestry of life, in hushed lectures, in museum plaque, and in the strategic breeding programs of zoos and seed banks. His name endures as a cautionary refrain, that purity of line, pursued without restraint, can yield nothing but a hollow crown and a legacy of sorrow. And so, amidst the sound of gentle breezes rustling through palace gardens and the quiet murmur of scholars in stately halls, the story of Charles II lingers on, a somnolent whisper, reminding us that true strength lies not in isolation, but in the shared richness of difference. The scientific legacy of Charles II extends far beyond the dusty pages of 18th century medical treatises. His tragic life helped to lay the groundwork for the modern field of genetics. In 1908, the British biologist William Bateson revisited the concept of the inbreeding coefficient, drawing on the stark Habsburg data to illustrate the perils of excessive consanguinity. Bateson cited the calculated coefficient of 0.254 for Charles II, higher than that theoretically possible for sibling offspring, to demonstrate how genetic isolation accumulates harmful mutations. His lectures and publications introduced this quantitative measure to a broader scientific audience, framing heredity not merely as a matter of pedigree charts, but as a mathematical balance of gene variants. As the 20th century progressed, and Gregor Mendel's laws of inheritance were rediscovered and expanded upon, the case of Charles II resurfaced in the academic discourse of leading institutions such as Harvard and Cambridge. Graduate theses pored over the Habsburg records, analyzing the documented symptoms in light of dominant and recessive traits. Professors used the example of Charles's mandibular prognathism, his pronounced Habsburg jaw, as a cautionary demonstration of how a single autosomal dominant mutation can persist and magnify in a closed lineage. In seminars on human genetics, students learned that the triad of Charles's conditions, pituitary failure, renal tubular acidosis, and possible lysosomal storage disorder, could be traced back to the unchecked inheritance of deleterious alleles. By the early 21st century, advances in next-generation sequencing enabled scientists to revisit Charles II's remains with unprecedented precision. In 2010, a multinational team extracted ancient DNA from bone fragments in the crypt of El Escorial. Their analysis confirmed the presence of mutations in the gene PROP1, implicated in combined pituitary hormone deficiency, and in genes affecting calcium and potassium channels in muscle fibers, explaining his chronic cytures. Even more striking was the identification of variants in genes associated with lysosomal storage diseases, correlating with post-mortem findings of neuronal and renal cell storage anomalies. These genomic revelations brought closure to centuries of conjecture, definitive proof that Charles's suffering resulted from a confluence of genetic disorders exacerbated by inbreeding. The cultural imprint of the Habsburg jaw has also been indelibly stamped across European literature and art. Gothic novelists and playwrights seized upon Charles II's life as inspiration for tales of hereditary curses and ancestral guilt. In dimly lit drawing rooms, audiences shivered at stage adaptations that cast the last Habsburg monarch as a doomed prince haunted by spectral ancestors. Baroque painters tasked with immortalizing royal dignity struggled to mask his grim deformities, yet often highlighted the anguish in his eyes. The protruding jaw and the constantly exposed tongue, these portrait, now studied by art historians, convey both the period's aesthetic norms and a deep empathy for a ruler trapped by his own genes. Beyond the realm of human genetics, Charles II's legacy has found a place in conservation biology. Programs aimed at rescuing critically endangered species have taken heed of the tragic history of Europe's most storied dynasty in managed breeding of the Iberian lynx. For example, scientists calculate inbreeding coefficients before pairing individuals, ensuring that gene flow remains robust. Similar strategies guide the propagation of red deer in European reserves. Researchers track lineage to avoid mating between closely related stags and hinds. These efforts, born from an understanding of Charles II's genetic tragedy, underscore the principle that the health of a population, whether human or animal, depends on the diversity of its gene pool. In botanical science, seed banks apply the same lessons when preserving heirloom crops. By maintaining multiple varieties of wheat, rice, or maize, researchers guard against the vulnerability that can arise in a monoculture. The parallel with Charles II's plight is clear: a single lineage, however prestigious, can falter if its genetic makeup becomes too narrow to resist environmental stresses or novel pathogens. Even today, as genome editing and synthetic biology promise to reshape life itself, the story of Charles II remains a sobering reminder that the most advanced tools cannot override the basic truths of heredity. When we consider the implications of CRISPR-induced modifications or the establishment of gene drives, we recall the fatal lesson of a monarch whose every breath was toil, whose every cell bore the weight of centuries of isolation. His life teaches that diversity is not merely a scientific abstraction, but a vital bulwark against the fragility of existence. Thus, the final chapter of Charles II's legacy is not simply a historical footnote. It lives on in the textbooks of geneticists, in the artwork of galleries, and in the breeding protocols of conservation programs. His suffering, etched into the double helix of his DNA, resonates as a cautionary tale that the richness of life, its resilience, its adaptability, its capacity to endure springs not from purity, but from the vibrant tapestry woven by countless threads of varied heritage. And in that gentle, somnolent whisper of memory, we find both sorrow and guidance, urging us to cherish the diversity that sustains us all. At the conclusion of Charles II's story, it becomes clear that his tragedy was not merely a personal suffering, but also a profound warning about how we handle our genetic heritage and the exercise of power. First and foremost, the tale underscores the value of humility. Despite bearing the splendor of royalty, Charles could not overcome the laws of biology, reminding us that power and lofty status alone cannot shield us from nature's limitations. Furthermore, the most significant message is the importance of genetic diversity. The attempt to preserve a pure bloodline within the Habsburg dynasty led to catastrophic consequences, teaching us that mixing, intermingling, and expanding our connections are the pathways to maintaining health, vitality, and a sustainable future. This lesson applies not only to ancient royal houses, but also to all communities, from families and societies to natural ecosystems, where diversity helps us resist disease, adapt to change, and thrive over the long term. Finally, through this video, we learn the value of listening to science and respecting specialized knowledge. Medical examinations, genetic analyses, and historical research have illuminated the root causes of Charles II's tragedy, helping humanity to better understand both the power and the limits of our genes. Transparency and openness, though sometimes painful, are essential if we are to draw lessons and avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. Therefore, when the screen goes dark, what remains with the audience is not merely the image of a crippled king, but a deep reflection on our individual and collective responsibilities to cherish diversity, to heed the voice of science, and to remain humble before nature, so that we may shape a healthier and more sustainable future for ourselves and for generations to come.